Welcome back to a special episode of Drilling It Down. Going to be a shorter episode than expected. So this is your host, Wes Lyon, co-hosting Tyler Ott. Ty, welcome back.
Always good to be here.
Yeah, so today, funny, I think I've recorded this 3 or 4 times and things changed so much. Originally, the title of this episode was actually going to be about an hour or 2 hour long webinar, and it was going to be The Great Tax War. I had the slides, did all the prep work. I think, on my shock, we're not going to have the Great Tax War. So just for everyone out there, we are going to talk about taxes, how the election impacts it. Our job's to remove the emotion from this. So we're not sitting here. It's not, that we're trying to say it's some great thing or bad thing or what's going on. It just wasn't what we expected when we were looking at it. So, So Tyler, I think, what did we expect?
I think we expected not every chamber of government to go one direction, and there would be some fight and there would be some war. But it's looking like, so we know the presidency is going for Trump. We know that the Senate is Republican, and the House hasn't been called yet, but I just did a little research. It's looking pretty strongly towards the Republicans. So if we have a Republican-controlled Congress as well as a Republican-controlled presidency, where's the war going to occur?
Well, I'll throw a little curveball your way.
Okay.
So the reason, and we'll kind of back up and kind of tell everyone what we expected. And again, we're not political pundits here. It's not our job. It's removing the emotion. The House looks like it's going to go Republican as of the recording of this a day or two after the election. We expected the House to go Democrat, and we expected the Senate to go Republican. So we expected a split Congress. It's not what appears to be what's going to happen. So that's really why we expected this great tax war. And again, it's not that we were trying to root one way or the other. We're just looking over the day. They're going, basically to get down to it, we kept it as simple as possible. It looks like there's a bunch of House seats up that are in places that historically vote Democratic, and it looks like there's some Senate seats up in places that historically vote Republican. So for that, we thought, hey, there didn't look like a lot in danger the Democrats would flip in the Senate, and there didn't look like a lot in danger the Republicans would flip in the House, and that was just kind of what we expected. The presidency, I think we were all, I don't know, I didn't have an opinion on it until, took me about 1 a.m. to have an opinion on it, about 3:30 or 4 a.m. to really feel like I actually had something to say about it. So that was just, we thought there'd be this split and a really big tax war over that. And the reason there'd be a big tax war is the individual mandates are set to expire, right, Tyler?
Yeah. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, Trump tax law, was created in 2017, enacted in 2018. Provisions of all these were set to expire after 2025. That's how it was written. Now, Trump in office, Congress controlled by Republicans, there's a little more option or control on, which way that's going to go, impacts of that changes there.
Yes, and what happened back in the day was when they project out the federal deficits, I think if you, and again, we are not political experts, so I'm going to botch this to some extent. I have not gone through the rabbit hole of spending 50 hours trying to figure out exactly how politics work. I care about tax law. But I believe that in order to pass a law that projects the federal deficit to go up by a certain amount in 10 years, that you have to have 60 senators pass the bill. If not, if you can only get 50, I think what they did to get around it said, okay, we're going to hit that threshold. We need 60. We don't have 60. So what they did was they made the individual provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act temporary, not permanent. And that meant at the end of 2025, no matter who was in office, what happened, if nothing happened and a law was not passed, that everybody's taxes would go up. And again, we were just joking as we're recording this, going through some things, going, hey, we're not here to say what's on the TV. We're here to just things in writing, things we know. And, everybody's taxes were going to go up if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or they will if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act individual mandates do not pass. So for that reason, we thought there would be a big tax war, right? It doesn't matter who's in. The Democrats don't want to raise taxes on every single American. They wanted to cut it off at 400 or 450, depending on which piece of literature you wrote or read. But, they want to keep taxes lower there. And they even potentially want to make them even lower for the people making less than that. And they want to go higher on the opposite end. Meanwhile, the Republicans, tough to say, is we're going to kind of get into what they want, because now it seems like they'll get what they want. The curveball I'm going to throw you, and the reason I thought there was going to be, we were calling it the great tax war in the CPA world, was the debt ceiling is also coming up for debate. And it does, again, I don't really know politics that well, but the debt ceiling needing to be increased, because obviously we're not paying down our debt next year. The debt ceiling needed to be increased is going to give leverage. And I don't know how much, since we're going to have one party control, but there still is going to be leverage there on getting that debt ceiling. So if everyone, thinks back of what causes the government, or why do we go into these government shutdowns? If you hear about it, it's usually the debt ceiling. And I could be a little off. I don't pay that much attention to it. I tend to think here in Charlotte, the federal government shutting down isn't going to be the end of the world. Tyler, you were in D.C. for a lot longer than I was. It's probably a bigger deal up there, but
a little bigger. But the places I were working, I was still working.
Yeah, so that's kind of what we thought was going to come about. But now we've got a new situation, and it appears, that we're going to have Republican control with the Trump presidency. So you would think that we're probably going to get the tax bill that Trump wants. So, Tyler, what does he want?
So he just wants to make the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent. So everything that he presented in 2017 and that was in effect since 2018 is just going to remain in effect until, I guess 60 senators 20 years from now decide that something else needs to happen.
Yeah, that's it. And for those of you listening, we were joking back and forth on what the TV says, what goes on. I said, no. I pulled the Trump campaign website, and we just want to see what's in there. There's 3 lines. Let's see how many sentences are here. I think it's just 2 sentences. There are 2 sentences relating to taxes, what they want to do. I just read it. Republicans will make permanent the provisions of the Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that doubled the standard deduction, expanded the child tax credit, and spurred economic growth for all Americans. This next one really won't apply to dental, but we will eliminate taxes on tips for millions of restaurant and hospitality workers and pursue additional tax cuts. So there you kind of have it. I think the first sentence says it all. They want to make permanent. And, we were a little young for this back in the day. However, I believe the current set of rates that we were under were also done under the same manner. I believe it was the Bush presidency, and I believe he went in and lowered the rates, but they were also temporary. But then they had enough votes, they made them permanent. And we're not that old, so we probably were dealing with high school sports or something and not caring. But at the time, I don't believe that this was as big of a deal as it would have been coming into this one. So I think something similar where it's, probably just going to extend the current provisions, which I think on the upside, the tax rates went a little bit lower for everybody. On the downside or upside, depending how you look at it, the 20% qualified business income deduction could be here to stay.
And that's what I was going to say. What is the biggest impact to dentists? Probably, it's going to be still having that option of maximizing it if you're in that income range.
So for those of you who aren't as familiar, because CPAs tend to leave this one alone, it's pretty complex planning, but the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, what was going on right there, if you kind of remove the emotions from it, was a bunch of corporations were fleeing, and the hot spot to go to was Ireland, and they weren't bringing their money back because, well, were we 35%, 40? I can't remember exactly what our corporate income tax rate was, but we had a very, very punitive corporate income tax rate, one of the highest in the world. And that's why corporations were fleeing was, their mandate is to increase shareholder value, and giving a high percentage of profits over to taxes goes against that mandate, So Trump's idea, his team, was they want to encourage these corporations to come back. And in order to do that, they lowered the tax rate. We were 21 or 17. We don't really deal with corporate income tax here, so we're not as familiar. We know our stuff like the back of our hand, but they lowered that rate to get the corporations to stay. That was always permanent. So when we look at this end of 2025, this tax law expiring, provisions were expiring, and it was the individual provisions. The corporate provisions were not expiring. So that brought the tax rate down for corporations. Big problem they ran into was when they looked in and dove into the data, they realized that, some of these big corporations, when you actually look at the shareholder level between the corporate income tax and the tax rate they were going to pay as individuals, you were actually going to pay less in certain scenarios as a C corporation than you were a subchapter S corporation. Now, given that most small businesses in America operate as a subchapter S corporation or a sole proprietor or something else, most small businesses are no longer C corporations because the small businesses were going to pay more in certain situations than the large businesses. Obviously, we had a problem here politically. Again, not really. I want small business owners to pay less because I am one and we deal with them every day. That's what we do for a living. However, just removing that emotion from it and saying, hey, okay, maybe you don't think that's a bad idea or whatever it is. Politically, obviously, they didn't want to be out there having somebody on the campaign trail going, they're taxing you more than they're taxing Apple. I mean, that's my one thing on politics. I say I'm pretty certain that would have been devastating for any candidate. So what they did was they came up with a patch. I call it a patch. A true fix would have been to make sure that the individual rates probably go down lower, but that wasn't what they wanted to put onto it. So what they did was created this 20% qualified business income deduction, or QBI. The QBI is an extra 20% deduction on your individual tax return that relates to your business profits. Only the profits, not your salary, not what goes into your retirement plan, only your profits. However, there is a phase-out range, so not everybody qualifies for this. If you make $1 million as a dentist in profit, you make too much to qualify. So a lot of our complex planning actually happens around, okay, how do we set up the retirement plan, the salary, everything perfect so that we maximize this QBI? And Tyler, I feel like you've been doing it long enough now. It doesn't take as much time, but the first few times you do this calculation, it takes you like 10 hours to figure everything out because it's pretty complex. So what all is going into this calculation that makes it so complex?
Yeah, so you got the salary. So obviously, lower the salary, you're going to have higher profit, higher income. So you got to balance that in there. Also comes the retirement plan contribution. So you lower the salary, you might not be able to get a lower retirement plan. You might get a lower retirement plan contribution versus you might raise the salary, get a higher retirement plan contribution, but then that decreases the profit. So then you get a lower QBI. But also there's some instances where we can get a large retirement plan contribution where we're able to bring the income down so that someone who was above the threshold now becomes eligible for the threshold. Now, the other part that we also need to account for is payroll taxes, the impact of increasing the salary versus getting a little more in the QBI deduction. You can kind of see how you may not follow along with what I'm saying, how confusing that can get.
Yeah, the one last thing in there is staff cost of the retirement plan too. So even if you can keep the benefit level the same, as you lower the salary, you lower the payroll taxes, but you might increase the staff cost. Yeah. So you've got to get in there. And I mean, we tried to build about 8 different calculators to do this, and eventually we just came to the conclusion that you just have to run it both ways with the facts. And eventually, you do a few hundred of them and you get used to it and you go, okay, now I get this retirement plan thing enough. I'm going to ballpark it and I'm going to bet I'm going to be right. But
yeah, we would do multiple retirement plan proposals, multiple tax scenarios just to see, and then run it through our cash flow. It was a lot, but yes, as we got into it, as my experience grew, knowledge grew, it's much easier now. Yeah.
It becomes like doing something like the back of your hand, but it's kind of like, if you're a dentist and the first time, you're doing an endo procedure or something, you're going to be a little shaky. Yep. Eventually you get good. But a lot of the CPAs, because it's not really their job to understand the retirement plans, and that's a big portion of it, is what impact does moving this salary have on my retirement plan? And am I going to do something? A CPA doesn't want to come in there and the maximum salary you can pay for a retirement plan is like $345. And that's pretty darn close to that taxable income threshold to phase out of QBI. So as you go down, let's say, hey, I'm going to go down from 345 to 200, your retirement plan, how much you give the staff. In order to put extra money in for you, you always have to pass testing and you have to give the staff. Problem is, those aren't done on dollar amounts. They're done on percentage of compensation. So if your benefit's the same and your W-2 is lower, and that's what your retirement plan's based off of, you have a higher percentage, which means your staff are going to have a higher percentage. So now all of a sudden, I'm not here to dog the CPAs. It's just they don't know that. They've never needed to know that. Understanding retirement plans like the back of their hand and what moving salaries, changes on staff cost is not something they're going to be able to learn very quickly. So for that reason, a lot of people have ignored this planning. And, I think from a CPA standpoint, some of us were probably going, oh, if the QBI went away, our lives would get a lot easier. So good news and bad news. I mean, good news is we're not going to have major tax changes for everybody. Bad news is we still have the complex planning.
Yep.
But there's, something interesting in here, and pursue additional tax cuts.
Yeah, that's where it's, what you've heard on TV, he said, she said, who knows? It's not in writing, so there's a lot that can be changed and up in the air. So
I'm only going to go over one on the he said, she said, but the reason I want to go over this one is because I've heard it, and it might have even, I can't remember. I looked at the Green Book, which is the president's proposal. It's been a while. It's funny. We had this webinar ready to go. We're leaving California from our Napa seminar, and John looks at me and goes, "You better hold off on that. Biden's not going to be the candidate." And I'm going, "Well, how do you know that?" And I won't say it, publicly, but John had some insider information. Sure enough, about 3 or 4 days later, Biden's no longer the candidate. So we waited to see if something else would come out. Then we actually did record the webinar of the Great Tax War, and it became less and less factual there. And the less and less factual we got, the less comfortable we felt with putting it out there. So we decided to wait and see if we get as factual as we can. But the one thing commonly I kind of saw as I was doing all this research between both was expanding the child tax credit. So that is one where I could see the child tax credit being expanded for everybody. So whether or not there's income limits on there, how it actually shakes out, I don't know. But it seemed like it was something that the Democrats wanted. It seemed like something the Republicans, I don't know if the Republicans came out as strongly for it, but, I would assume, given the Republican stance on things, if the Democrats came and said, we're willing to extend your law, but we want to expand the child tax credit, I don't think you'd get a lot of pushback. So that's one I could see going through. Otherwise, when it comes to additional tax cuts, start calling your lobbyist if you want something. Yeah. I don't know. My guess would be as good as anyone else. I mean, from the he said, she said, we've heard the no tax on overtime issue. I don't know about that one. I always think through things, hey, what do they want to do and what can feasibly be done? Like for example, the Democrats in their proposal wanted to tax unrealized gains. Whether or not you want to tax that as somebody that works in the tax industry, that is a nightmare and is going to cost so much money to enforce. Yeah. There's going to be so many legal battles over what something is worth or not worth. I mean, that's just, if you want to do it, it's just not feasible to do it. The no overtime thing, I was thinking through this. I might have the same opinion on the no overtime. And I was like, well, what if they did that? Would we want to move everybody hourly here? I mean, wouldn't you want some of your pay in overtime if you're not getting taxed on it? Yeah. So I don't know how feasible that one is either. Even the no tax on tips, I don't know exactly how feasible that is and what people do on it. So kind of wait to be seen, but overall, I think we're likely to extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Pretty simply, yeah.
Yeah, so those of you out there, hopefully the world will return to sanity next week and we'll stop having to get all the election ads or 8 phone calls a day.
That's the best. Commercials, don't have to have those anymore. Don't have to have any text messages, phone calls. That's going to be incredible.
I know. You should have been able to go to the early voting and check a box where it goes, look, I voted. Stop. Like, I don't need to hear from you. And gosh, I don't know about you, but I still get it from Virginia. I have my mom's old cell phone number, so Georgia contacts me, and somehow they think I'm my dad, and he owns property in South Carolina. So I get 4 dang states where I'm like, you guys know I only vote in the state I'm registered.
Yeah, I was definitely getting some Virginia ones, but it's always hard to tell if it's because I don't pick them up, if it's truly an election or if it's just another robocaller. Yeah.
Oh, they have all those data centers out in Ashburn. So a lot of the robocallers have Northern Virginia phone numbers. Makes it really tough if you're in Northern Virginia to know who's actually calling and what's, they're calling me all the time for, you need to apply for Medicare. I'm like, you got the wrong Wes Lyon. Yeah. I'm not the one that's applying for Medicare. Overall, though, not a whole lot of change here coming. We're likely to see it made permanent. It will be interesting. The last thing I'll kind of say is what they do if they fully extend the estate tax limits. But otherwise, I don't think we're going to get a humongous change that really changes how we plan. So now is a really, really good time. If you've kind of been putting it off, waiting and seeing, now's a really good time to get back in the saddle, get everything planned out. We feel pretty good about what's going to move forward.
Yep, absolutely.
Otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and we'll be with you next time. And for those of you who like the entertainment, sorry it wasn't more entertaining. I was kind of looking forward to this one, the Great Tax War, but the Great Tax War is no more.
Yeah,
so,
it was a landslide.
So hey, fortunately, I was really looking forward to having all you guys that have never had to stay up till 4 a.m. reading a 10,000-page tax law. I was really looking forward to that.
And we got 4 years. There could be changes. So
at some point we'll get a new one. But no big changes. So everyone, make sure big takeaways. Make sure you have a written tax plan. If you don't have a written tax plan, highly recommend that you either come to one of our seminars, give us a call. McGill and Lyon Dental Advisors, 704-424-9780. Make sure you have a plan, especially now that this stuff is permanent. I think people tend to put things off as they think there's going to be a lot of change right around the corner. I don't want to do it now. And then I come in and, all right, great. We're past that. Everybody needs to get their lives in good financial standing and move forward. And hopefully everyone will be nice to each other again. At least I find it funny. On the TV, they're not nice to each other, but I've never seen anyone in person not be nice to each other. But hopefully people on the TV won't be projecting their anger at everybody else. They can just go in a back room.
Go back to the news.
Yeah, get back to the news. With that, thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll be with you next time.
Thanks for having me.